All right, Adam. So I think one of the best places to start is just getting a little bit of sense of your background and what kind of drew you towards the life that you've led, researching the brain, and in particular, something like imagination, a very unique construct to dedicate so much of your thought to. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I feel that I've come full circle in a way, but it's been a very extensive circle. So I began at school with an interest in literature, particularly, um, but I was also interested in the sciences, and so I left school very unclear what I wanted to do, what I wanted to study, let alone what I wanted to do with my life. But I eventually found my way to a degree in philosophy and psychology, which actually suited me very well. And through psychology, I really discovered the brain. For some reason, I don't think I'd been taught any biology at school at all. I just missed out on it. And in fact, biology is a great subject for somebody who's interested in both in the humanities and in the sciences. In a way, it brings them together through natural history. So I discovered the brain through psychology, realized that this fascinated me, and I was fascinated particularly by the question of how what happens in our brains gives rise to what passes through our minds somehow or other. Um, and my dad, in fact, who wasn't very prone to giving advice, suggested that if I was interested in the brain, I might consider studying medicine, because he said it would give a broad horizon. And although it then involved a long detour through things like hernias and appendectomies, it actually was very good advice because I greatly enjoyed studying to be a doctor and have enjoyed practicing as a doctor. So that was my route into neurology. It was really through a fascination with, I guess, the problem of consciousness, how consciousness comes to be through goings on in the brain. Um, and I think my background in psychology had also given me an interest in what is special about the human mind, what distinguishes human minds from other animal minds. And I think one strong candidate is imagination, our capacity to detach ourselves from the here and now and recollect the past, anticipate the future, enter the virtual worlds created by artists or revealed by scientists. And so, kind of running in the background, there was a curiosity about what makes us special and about the possibility that imagination might be relevant. And perhaps that was fueled by my earlier interest in the humanities. Um, and have practiced through most of my career as a cognitive neurologist. So, a neurologist who looks after people who have problems with cognition, most commonly dementia. Um, but along the way, about 20 years ago, I encountered a patient who'd lost the ability to visualize, which was I thought, a very intriguing neurological symptom and which connected with this interest in imagination. And so that was how I sort of moved into research focused on visual imagery, but with a broader interest in the science of imagination alongside that.
Yeah. And so how have things evolved for you then after that first patient that you were that was sent your way without imagery? How's that journey kind of unfolded in the
Yeah,
past 20
very
plus years?
serendipitously, really. So I had an existing research interest which had been running for some time on interactions between epilepsy and memory,
Mm.
and that was quite absorbing and reasonably productive. But the patient who was referred to me with an inability to visualize, I found very intriguing, and he was a delightful man, a very good research participant. He was in his mid 60s, very articulate, and he just had this single focal alteration in his experience. So nothing had changed except that now, when he's tried to visualize, he can no longer do so. And he'd been a very visual person. He used to visualize faces of friends and family to help himself get to sleep. When he read a novel, he would enter a vivid visual world. If he lost his keys, he said he'd be able to visualize where he'd put them. And he could no longer do any of that. His dreams lost their visual quality. So he gave this very compelling account of a really salient change in his experience, but in the absence of any other kind of cognitive deficits. And in fact, it was very hard to identify any correlates for this change in his experience. So, as you'd expect, if you asked him to rate the vividness of his images, he rated them at zero, essentially, at floor. No image at all. I'm just thinking about whatever it is you've mentioned, an apple or my front door. Um, but he performed well on all other standard neuropsychological tests, and he could even answer questions which you might think would require imagery, like which is darker, the green of grass or the green of a pine tree. So most people answering a question like that will actually conjure up those two items and compare the shades. And he could give correct answers to questions like those, but he said he just knew that no imagery was involved. So eventually we did a brain imaging study in which we found that when he looked at faces, he had normal brain activation. He activated visual areas as you'd expect, just like control participants. But when he tried to imagine them, he failed to activate visual areas which people with imagery will activate. So imagery, visualization is a kind of echo of vision in the brain, a kind of weak echo of vision. You activate the same visual areas, but you do so more weakly. And he seemed unable to do that, and he hyperactivated some areas involved in cognitive control and effort. And I thought this was very interesting. We wrote a paper about him. I didn't expect it necessarily to go too much further. But then Carl Zimmer, whose name you might know, very good American science journalist, picked up the story, wrote about this man in Discover magazine. And then over the next few years, people began getting in touch saying, I'm just like this character, MX, we'd call him in the paper, except that I always have been. I've always recognized that I'm a little bit different in this, just in this respect. When other people recollect last year's holiday, they seem to have an experience that's a bit visual, and I don't get that. And once a dozen or so people had been in touch, it looked as if there was a kind of interesting story here, because they were giving reasonably consistent accounts. So we responded by sending them a vividness questionnaire, which measures the vividness of your imagery, gives you a score from 16/80 to 80/80. There are 16 scenarios which you're invited to visualize, and then you rate your image from 1/5, which is no image at all, just thinking about it, to 5/5, which is as vivid as real seeing. And these folk were all scoring down towards 16/80. And then we asked a series of common sense questions like, how did you discover? What emotional impact did it have? How's your memory for past personal events? Do you dream visually? And through this questionnaire, we again established that there was a fairly consistent pattern. So people tended to discover in their teens or 20s. It would often be when they were reminiscing with family or friends, or sometimes when they were given something like a meditation exercise. Didn't usually have a major emotional impact. They were more curious than they were upset by this discovery. Quite often, vision wasn't the only sense affected. So slightly more than half said that they didn't think they had sensory imagery in any sense modality, so no mind's ear and no mind's fingertip. Most of them said that their memory for past personal events seemed to be rather thin. Most of them really rather intriguingly dreamt visually, so there seemed to be a dissociation between wakeful imagery and dreaming imagery. So we decided that we should write a paper about these folk, which we did, but we needed a name for the phenomenon, because up till then there wasn't a kind of catchy term. There were some very uncatchy terms like defective revisualization or visual irreminiscence. So I consulted a classicist friend, and he said, why don't you borrow Aristotle's term for the mind's eye, Aphantasia, and tag an A on the end? So that was how Aphantasia was born, as a description for this inability to visualize, which quite often seems to be associated with reduced imagery and other sense modalities too. And words are quite powerful things. The term caught on, the press liked it, so we received quite a bit of publicity, which I hadn't expected at all. And then over the next few years, the 20 contacts I'd had turned into now approaching 20,000.
Wow.
Most of them from people with aphantasia at the very low end of the vividness spectrum, but a proportion from people with what we've called hyperphantasia, who describe imagery which is as vivid as real seeing. So it's been a kind of exciting journey, a completely unexpected one, and it's depended quite a bit on press coverage and the internet. Really, it's the kind of research that I think the internet has facilitated.
Yeah, in terms of prevalence, what are we looking at for the spectrum of something like complete severe aphantasia to something
Yeah.
like hyperphantasia?
So the 16/80 people are probably about 1% of the population. If you push your threshold up a bit, the figure is around 4%. So I think around 4% of people have either no wakeful imagery or very much reduced wakeful imagery. So it's a substantial proportion. It's a substantial number of people around the world.
Yeah.
It's similar, for example, to prosopagnosia. That severe difficulty in recognizing faces. So that's at the low end of the spectrum. Hyperphantasia seems a bit more common. So if you look at people with scores of 80/80, that's a few percent. And if you look at people with a score of above 75 or 80, that's getting up to around 10%. So there seem
Do
to be more vivid images than there are people who lack imagery.
in general near the the peak of the bell curve within a few standard deviations, do we see most people do fall within a normal distribution where most people kind of have a dim image of elite or something
So
like that?
actually, if you use the vividness of visual imagery questionnaire as your measure, which is that's 16 over 80 to 80 over 80
Hmm.
measure, um, the mean score is actually up around 60. So
Oh wow.
it's not evenly distributed across that range. So in a way, it's not surprising that you see more people up at the high end than you do down at the low end. 16 is a long way from 60. Um,
Yeah.
it, um, Several standard deviations down.
Fair enough. Well, and so this is something that I've, for myself, just to kind of loop my perspective into this story. I discovered I'm 30, going on 38 here very soon, and I don't think I discovered it until about 2 years ago that I am most certainly severely aphantasic. And for me, it was interesting because trying to describe it to people, it's one of those things that people think is just a semantic issue. I'm just describing it poorly. So, what can we say that we've found in terms of hard evidence for this? In the brain, are we seeing very clear markers that say this happens for aphantasia people and this doesn't happen for, or
Yeah,
vice versa?
yeah,
Do we have clear evidence?
yeah. So I mean, of course, that's the skeptical response would be, well, how can one person compare the vividness of his imagery or her imagery with the vividness of someone else's, as we don't have an opportunity to climb inside anyone else's head,
Yeah.
and that's a fair response. So you have to triangulate between subjective report, which seems to me a perfectly reasonable place to start,
Mm-hmm.
and other kinds of more objective measures, particularly behavioural measures. So if it's going to be helpful if you can find some cognitive abilities which seem to co-vary with the vividness of imagery, but also more objective physiological measures, possibly measures of brain activity. And we have been able to triangulate in that general sense. So starting with behavioural measures, for example, probably the most consistent association with aphantasia subjectively is with thin autobiographical memory, relatively reduced memory for salient past personal events. So people with aphantasia tend to feel that their recollection is less rich and the descriptions they can give are less rich than those of their friends and relations. And you can measure that moderately objectively using something called the autobiographical interview, which kind of encourages you to pull up as much detail as you can about all aspects of past memories, and it then measures them. And people with aphantasia do indeed turn out to score below control participants and well below hyperphantasic participants. Interestingly, that's also true of imagined scenarios. So there seems to be quite a close relationship between recollecting the past and imagining the future. And people with
Mm.
aphantasia give rather thin descriptions both of recollected past events and imagined future events. So that's an example of a behavioural measure which co-varies with imagery vividness. And then in terms of physiology, before we come to the brain, there have been a couple of nice experiments along these lines. So first, an experiment looking at pupil responses. So if you look into the sun or look at a bright light, your pupils will of course constrict, and if you look into a dark room, your pupils will dilate. And it turns out that if you have imagery and you imagine looking into the sun, your pupils constrict, and if you imagine looking into a dark room, your pupils dilate. That doesn't happen in people with aphantasia. And similarly, if you read people with imagery a really scary story, they will sweat. There's an increase in skin conductance. And this doesn't happen in people with aphantasia. But they do show this change in skin conductance when they look at scary pictures. So it's not that people with aphantasia can't mount this emotional response, it's that written descriptions don't do it. And the I think plausible explanation given is that the way written descriptions kind of give you a gut response is via imagery. And because imagery is a kind of emotional amplifier, and if you lack imagery, then you don't experience that gut response. So those are a couple of physiological examples. And then there have now been several brain imaging studies, and it looks as if there are differences between people with aphantasia and average imagery or vivid imagery, but they're not not altogether straightforward differences.
Mm.
Um, I think we conducted the first study of this kind, and the neatest finding in that study was that if you do a resting state brain imaging study, so this is just looking at activity in the resting brain, you find stronger connections between regions at the front of the brain, which have to do really with thinking, and regions at the back of the brain that have to do with vision in people with vivid imagery than in people with faint imagery.
Mm.
So the intuitive interpretation would be that if you're having a thought and you're hyperphantasic, it's going to kind of translate itself into imagery more readily than if you're aphantasic. So that's one finding. But then several studies have looked to see whether there is a stark difference between activity in visual regions during visualization in people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia, and it doesn't seem that there is an enormous difference, but there are measurable, more subtle differences. So, for example, it looks as if the connectivity within those regions is somewhat different in people with aphantasia. So it's interesting that there do seem to be, if you like, imagery representations in the brains of people with aphantasia, but for some reason they aren't giving rise to the same sort of imagistic experience that they do in people with imagery. I think it's not surprising that we find those representations, because people with aphantasia, after all, can recognize
Yeah.
things. So people with aphantasia clearly know what things look like. They have in their brains representations of visual items. So it's not too surprising that those representations get activated to some degree during imagery attempts, but for some reason the activity isn't organized in a way that gives rise to the experience of imagery. So I'd say this is an evolving story. There have been
Yeah.
only 3 or 4 studies of this kind, and the kind of picture is gradually revealing itself, but isn't yet fully revealed.
Yeah, I think I heard one study recently say that the early visual processing seems to occur, but it's at the later stages that it seems like perhaps people with aphantasia don't have that later processing. And I think perhaps it was you, but the greatest metaphor that I've heard thus far is that the computer is on, it's running all the data, everything is there, the computer has full knowledge of everything. It's just that the monitor is turned off.
Yeah,
And to me, that kind of is like the early visual processing is there, everything's there. It just doesn't go to the screen. It doesn't make that maybe final jump to the frontal cortex, like you were saying, or to the frontal
yeah,
regions of the brain.
yeah. That's a nice analogy. Um, and so it raises the question of whether people with aphantasia, in some sense, have unconscious imagery, which again
Mm.
is a kind of topic that's being debated at the moment. By,
Yeah. So there seems to be a lot of implications here. You mentioned before, like the imagining the future or thinking about the self in the past. And I've had friends joke with me in the past that I'm, stoic or a little bit more cold and calculating, or I'm not as emotionally responsive to things. And some of that I attributed for the longest time in my life to just like personal work. I was interested in Buddhist practices and
yeah,
mindfulness and these types of things. And now I can't help but think I might have been aided quite heavily by the fact that I truly may have a bit of emotional distance from really visceral imagery that draws me in and kind of awakens my arousal
yeah,
response to something really, uh, you know, just overwhelming, really.
yeah,
So, do we see something with emotional reactivity or emotional sensitivity?
yeah.
Is that a growing
So
thing to note?
I think that's a really interesting question, and at the moment I can only really comment through anecdotes, of
Mm-hmm.
which I've now encountered many, because we haven't researched this systematically, though I'm hoping to. So just as you described, people with aphantasia often say that they feel that they move on more easily than others. They
Mm-hmm.
move on from a breakup or change cities more easily because they're not troubled by kind of sensory recollections of the place or the person they've lost. And similarly, they're perhaps better at living in the present because they're less preoccupied by anticipation of what might be coming in the future, sort of visceral sensory anticipations of what might be coming in the future. So
Yeah.
I suspect that aphantasia does allow a kind of presentness that may be more difficult for people with vivid imagery to achieve, because they're more likely to have thoughts of past and present in their mind, and there could be I think there are pros and cons to being on either at either extreme, but aphantasia might to some degree protect you from craving, for example, because we know
Mm,
that cravings are often driven by images, might to some degree protect you from something like PTSD, because you may be a little less likely to experience those intrusive recollections. And there's a bit of an aversive event, and there's a bit of experimental evidence in favour of that now. So I
yeah.
think that's a very interesting um, area to explore. I mean, as you hinted, I I think one has to be quite cautious here because, of course, vividness of visual imagery is just one, or vividness of sensory imagery, it's just one piece of the huge psychological jigsaw, and I wouldn't want to claim that I wouldn't want to make excessive claims for its
Absolutely.
importance. But it seems to me very plausible that it does, as you say, provide just a little emotional distance by comparison with hyperphantasia. And it's interesting that we hadn't expected this, but we asked people about their occupation, and we found in a larger study with about 2,000 people with aphantasia and 200 with hyperphantasia, we found that if that aphantasia nudges people towards STEM professions, whereas
Mm.
hyperphantasia nudges people towards what have traditionally been regarded as creative trades. Um,
Yeah, that makes sense. Is it a strong effect? You say nudge, but I mean, is it a quite
it's
profound?
significant, but
Yeah.
there are many exceptions to it. So I mean, one nice surprise. It's always nice to observe something and then kind of observe counterexamples which make you think about the initial observation. So, um, having noted this association between aphantasia and STEM professions, I was then really intrigued to be contacted by growing numbers of aphantasic artists.
Mm.
So I think I worked with a little interdisciplinary team, and I think we'd assumed that aphantasia would tend to make you less interested in the visual world, or it would sort of be associated with reduced interest in the visual world. But I now have at least 100 aphantasic artists sort of on the books, and many of them say that they feel actually lacking imagery is a kind of spur
Mm.
to artistic work, because if you can't see things in your mind's eye, then it's satisfying to be able to represent them in other
Yeah.
ways through sculpture or drawing or painting.
I was discussing this topic with a friend recently, and we got on the note of a topic of bias. And I wonder if you have any evidence for how maybe we respond to like preconceived notions. Because for me, when I bring something into my mind, it's a very sparse, almost like wireframe. It's a very loose concept, a placeholder almost, if you will, that doesn't really have a lot of details. It doesn't have a background. It's not filled with all of this imagery, and I wonder if there's any way in which that allows one to maybe see things not like in a better way, but like in a more pure sense where there's less how do I say this, baggage that comes with the
Less
thought.
clutter. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it seems like it might allow for a kind of clarity or like the ability to have a clean canvas or a blank slate to work from rather than bringing in so many of your associations. Does that make sense? And does that
it
have we
makes
seen
total
anything
sense to me.
like that?
So yes, I wondered what the kind of fundamental dimension that might separate the thinking of people with aphantasia from the thinking of people with aphantasia is, and very much as you describe, I think probably aphantasia nudges you in the direction of a more abstract,
Mm,
less experience near kind of thinking, you know, more like the thinking of a scientist than the thinking of a novelist, say.
mm,
Um, um, One of the first people to get in touch after we coined the term aphantasia, oddly enough, was Craig Venter,
mm,
the geneticist.
mm-hmm.
One of the first people to, I think his team was the first to decode the human genome, and he said that he'd recognised his own aphantasia for a long time, and that he'd always attributed some of his scientific prowess to the fact that
Mm,
precisely to the fact that his mind wasn't cluttered by imagery. Perhaps
yeah,
clutter is too pejorative, because I think there are benefits to the experience near kind of thinking as well. Um, I think reading fiction probably confers various benefits. But, besides
yeah,
enjoyment, it probably helps people to empathise, gives people a kind of broader um, take on the social world. So that, as I said earlier, I think there are pros and cons to being at either extreme.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think of a more sophisticated way to say it because I agree. I don't think it's pejorative, but it does seem to have a more of like a first order thinking kind of feel to it than maybe the alternative. I wonder, do we know if there's any like covariance or like co-occurrence with other conditions, something like ADHD or autism? Are we seeing any related
Yeah. Uh,
manifestations?
So there does seem to be an association between aphantasia and autism. I think that's the clearest
Hmm.
association. Developmental um, conditions like autism often coexist with other developmental conditions, so I wouldn't be surprised if other associations came to light. But certainly, autism is the one that we've encountered um, relatively often, and there is some epidemiological evidence for an association now, which prompts me to say that I don't think aphantasia is one thing.
Hmm.
I think it's a feature of experience, and I think very likely it can occur in different contexts. So this again, this needs more work, but I suspect there'll be subgroups. So there seems to be a group of people who have difficulties with face recognition and aphantasia, and maybe that's a particular thing. Um, there is a condition called SDAM now, severely deficient autobiographical memory, which is a which has been described by a different team, Brian Levine's team in Canada, and that has some overlap with aphantasia, but again, that may well be a separate subgroup, and it may be that the group of people who have autism and aphantasia is a separate group. So this is speculative at the moment because we haven't really defined these subgroups, but I'll be a bit surprised if aphantasia is a single entity, if you like. I think it's more likely heterogeneous or a feature of experience that can occur in different contexts.
And with that in mind, there is some evidence that there is a potential genetic or hereditary factor at play here, right? I don't know if we've found something as significant as like an allele mutation or something, but we do have some evidence
Yeah,
that it
so,
is
so there's certainly,
hereditary.
again, that just came to light as the emails were coming in that quite a lot of people were
Mm.
saying, my sister, my brother, my father, my mother, my child is aphantasic. And with the help of a geneticist, we worked out something called the sibling recurrence ratio, which is the increase in the likelihood that your sibling will have the same um, trait as you compared to the random compared to the random expectation, and the increase in risk was about tenfold.
Mm.
So, which is not huge, but is
Significant.
but is significant. So it does look as if there's a familial tendency, and quite likely that's partly explained by um, genetics. So that's something we're hoping to look at with the help of a big biobank in the UK. Um,
Does it seem like most people who have come forward have had aphantasia from birth? I know some people it seems to be tied to injury, but are
yeah.
for the most part people getting it from birth?
So the great majority of people have described it lifelong, or at least for as long as they can remember. And then there's a really interesting but relatively small minority of people who have imagery and then lose it, like the first patient I described,
Mm.
MX, who'd been a vivid visualizer and then lost the ability following a cardiac procedure. It was actually never quite clear what had happened. We assumed he'd had a small stroke. We didn't have an opportunity to study him close enough to the event to be sure of that. Um, but certainly there are neurological causes for losing imagery, including stroke, brain injury, um, meningitis, a variety of you know, relatively clear-cut neurological events can do this, and that had been described over about 100 years in not a huge number of cases, but at least 50 or so cases. And then interestingly, there are also psychological causes. So um, depression, depersonalization disorder, occasionally psychosis can be associated with loss of imagery. So it has both neurological and psychological psychiatric causes. I'm very keen to study those cases further because particularly both the neurological and the psychological, but the neurological causes where you can identify a lesion can be very informative about the network of brain areas that's involved. Because brain imaging gives you very nice pictures of networks in the brain, but it doesn't. It often fails to tell you which regions are crucial. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And how about any work in the realm of something like dreams or psychedelics? This is something I always get asked. What is the
Yeah,
experience on psychedelics? I don't know if
yeah,
you've looked into that at all, or like, do you dream? Do we know
yeah.
about either of these?
So the first observation was the one I mentioned, that the majority of people with aphantasia dream visually, which often comes as a kind of big surprise
Mm-hmm.
to the man in the street who thinks, well, how can this be? How can you have imagery in one situation but not in the other? I think the explanation for that is uh, probably reasonably straightforward. That the route to wakeful visualization in the brain is a very different one to the route to visualization in dreams. So if I ask you to visualize an apple here and now, that you have to, if you can, visualize
Yeah.
an apple. That's going to involve a kind of top-down process. So you have to make a decision that that's what you want to be doing with your mind at this moment.
Mm.
You then have to consult your memory banks to remind yourself what apples look like, and you then, it seems, drive the visual system in reverse. Sort of visualization has sometimes been described as vision in reverse, because you're activating your visual cortices, but you're doing so as a result of a deliberate decision, top down, rather than as a result of information streaming in from the eyes, as it does when we just look. So wakeful visualization tends to be a relatively deliberate, voluntary, top-down process, whereas visualization in dreams is driven very differently. Structures deep in the brain, in the brainstem and the hypothalamus, sort of organize the cycle of sleep and waking and the initiation of dreaming. So I think there are many subtleties here, but broadly speaking, dreaming is more of a bottom up than a top down process. So it doesn't surprise me so much that there's a dissociation between wakeful imagery and dream imagery. But to come back to your question,
Hmm.
while most people with aphantasia dream visually, there are quite a few who don't, and they describe really interesting varieties of dreaming. Perhaps we should talk about your dreams. So
I don't.
you don't. Okay.
I
So
don't have visuals. Yeah.
do you dream in other ways? Do you dream stories or events or
It's there's story. It's a
yeah,
story. There's like
yeah,
there's a narrative of sorts, but it's very kind of choppy, and it's
yeah.
in almost like conceptual snapshots.
Okay, okay, that's
Yeah.
fascinating. So I think there's a whole variety of sort of non-visual dreams which definitely are worthy of further exploration among people with aphantasia. And then psychedelics. I think there is someone in London who's collecting um, uh, experience under psychedelics from people with aphantasia. So there may be a kind of authoritative answer to this, but my impression so far, anecdotally, is that probably people with aphantasia have experience under psychedelics, which is a bit less rich than if you have vivid imagery to start with. But they do quite often experience vivid imagery, but it's rather like dream imagery. So it's there for the duration, but it doesn't the imagery doesn't carry over into ordinary wakefulness. So by and large, it doesn't confer normal wakeful imagery. It just gives people aphantasia an experience of imagery for the duration, for the while the psychedelic is acting on the brain.
Sure. Are there other things in this domain that you have found particularly interesting or surprising? Something that just struck you as a very unexpected result?
In the domain of aphantasia research generally.
Yeah, generally speaking. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, um, I think the phenomenon of aphantasic creativity I find particularly interesting. So, um, as I've mentioned, a number of aphantasic artists have been in touch, but also aphantasic novelists, for example, who say that they can write descriptive passages which evoke imagery in their readers, but not in them. Um, uh, one of the and clearly other forms of creativity are perfectly compatible with aphantasia. So, for example, one of our star speakers and participants in our research has been Ed Catmull, who was the president of Pixar, who won
Mm.
the Turing Prize for his discoveries in computer animation. He realized he was aphantasic when a friend of his, who was a meditator, asked him to visualize a sphere as a simple meditation induction procedure, and Ed realized that he couldn't see anything in his mind's eye, and he sort of didn't think too much of this, thought it was a bit odd, didn't reflect on it. But then, for various reasons, he got thinking about this down the line, and he began asking people he worked with whether they had imagery, and it turned out that his favourite animator, who's a guy called Glenn Keane, who did many of the drawings for Little Mermaid, was aphantasic and had recognised this for a long time, and had arguments with his mentors who'd said, "But you must be able to see things in your mind's eye. How can you draw otherwise?" And he'd said, "Well, I don't, but I can." So it's clear that the ability to visualize is important to creativity in some people with imagery, but it certainly doesn't preclude creativity and imagination in those with aphantasia. So I think it's given quite an interesting and unexpected insight into the nature of imagination, if you like, and the nature of creativity, which
Yeah.
one might, I think, you might have assumed had a much tighter link to sensory imagery than it seems to.
Yeah, I was particularly surprised because in the span of time between my studies at university, I wrote science fiction novels.
Yeah,
And for me, it was like spending 6 hours a day at least in my imagination, not realizing that I wasn't actually ever in
yeah,
my imaginations.
yeah, yeah. So how would you characterize the kind of imagination you were using to write those novels?
uh, it's so hard to say, as I'm sure that you're aware, but for me, I always come back to this idea of just, I have the knowing
Mm-hmm.
of what I'm thinking of, but I don't see it. I know what the image should look like,
Mm-hmm.
but there is no image. And but it is very sparse for me. I don't know if that's common for most people with aphantasia, but it's very like hyper focused on a specific detail that I'm moving between.
Mm-hmm. Would you say you have a strong spatial sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Because that's one interesting dissociation, if you like, that's come to light. So one of the questions which we asked people in the original questionnaire at the suggestion of a psychologist colleague of mine was, can you count the number of windows in your apartment or your house, without leaving your chair? And most
Hmm.
people with aphantasia say they can do that,
Hmm.
but they say they don't use imagery. They have some kind of schematic outline map,
Yeah.
which enables them to do it. Or sometimes they imagine cleaning them, or they imagine doing something, and that suggests that maybe there's a kind of spatial imagery which isn't very rich experientially, but nevertheless is useful. And there's a bit of evidence that indeed spatial imagery is distinct from object imagery, which is what seems to be lacking in people with aphantasia. And spatial imagery might even be stronger in some people with aphantasia than usual. And spatial imagery may be linked to mathematical thinking. So it could
Yeah.
sort of link into the STEM association.
There was a study, and I believe it was a study. I might just be misremembering some things here, but perhaps you can and pick up this thread if it rings any bells for you. But wasn't there some study where they had people describe how many objects were in a room, and people with aphantasia were able to,
Yeah.
they got less items, but they were more accurate, whereas people without aphantasia made more mistakes, but could
Yep. Yeah,
pick
that's
out
right.
more
So
items.
it's essentially copying a drawing
Hmm.
after a delay, and the result was exactly as you describe. There's also a questionnaire which tries to tease out spatial imagery from object imagery, and this distinction does have a kind of neurological basis. So there are two main streams of visual processing in the brain. There's a stream that goes from the visual cortex down into the temporal lobe, which is sometimes called the what stream, which seems to be involved in recognizing things essentially. So it's sort of high acuity vision, color vision, form. But then there's another stream that goes up into the parietal lobe, which has more to do with controlling movement under visual guidance. Originally it was called the where stream, it's sometimes called the how stream. So it may be that object imagery and spatial imagery involve activity in one or other of these two streams. So that could be the basis for this dissociation, possibly. And it seems that imagery in the what stream is experientially richer than imagery in the where or the how stream.
Yeah. It's a taboo subject for scientists, but do we know anything about how this relates to something like IQ? I wonder with the, a lot of IQ tests, you look at spatial manipulations and kind of predicting the next image in a set
Yeah.
kind of thing. Do we see any association
Well,
there?
so I suppose that I guess one thing to say at the outset is that when people first hear of aphantasia, they often think that it must be really disabling. And
Yeah.
how can you think if you don't have imagery? And indeed, Aristotle, um, who gave us our term, said the mind never thinks without a phantasm. So he thought that imagery was crucial to thinking, but it really doesn't seem to be. And one of the surprises about aphantasia is that people with aphantasia are very undisabled. They're,
Hmm.
they're fine. They're generally going about their lives and undertaking cognitive tasks without any difficulty at all. In our small study, which was the first kind of objective study looking at results of neuropsychological tests and brain imaging, we actually found that IQ was slightly but significantly higher in people with
Mm.
aphantasia. Now, I don't know that that's going to be borne out, but certainly
Yeah.
there isn't a deficit.
Yeah, interesting. Are there other factors maybe here that we haven't discussed that separate the two? We've discussed emotional reactivity, autobiographical memory, potentially some protectiveness against PTSD. Are there some other aspects here that separate the two that we might not have discussed?
So we haven't really touched on this face recognition
Mm.
aspect. So we just happened to notice that quite a few of our participants with aphantasia were describing difficulty in recognizing faces,
Mm.
and that's been borne out by subsequent research. So it's not a huge effect, but it's there. Um, I don't think many studies have looked at personality, but we did so in the study I mentioned, the neuropsychological brain imaging study, and we found um, um, a, some association between hyperphantasia and extroversion and openness,
Mm.
um, which has been linked to creativity. And we've mentioned the autism link with aphantasia. Um, I think we've
Yeah.
pretty much covered the
Testing your
bases there.
memory here a little bit. Where are we at in terms of looking for like what's the current state of things and where do you see this going? Are we gaining enough traction and inroads to start saying, we're seeing some um, good paths for future
Yeah,
exploration and research?
I've been astonished by the kind of small explosion of interest and research. So I reviewed 50 papers or so published over the last few years for a review article last year, and there have been a good number since then. I think there are still many questions to explore here. The ones I'm particularly interested in exploring are the existence of subtypes, which I mentioned. I think aphantasia is likely to exist in a number of forms, if you like, and it would be helpful to clarify those. I think there's still more to learn about the neural correlates. What are the fundamental differences in brain activity and possibly in brain structure between people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia? I'm keen to define the genetics if they exist, but I
Mm-hmm.
suspect they will. And I think the mental health associations are well worth exploring further. So it may well be that there are um, pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages to being at either extreme of the spectrum with respect to mental health. Um, the topics attracted quite a lot of interest in other areas, for example, in philosophy also.
Mm.
So um, questions like whether people with aphantasia might have unconscious imagery are being discussed by philosophers of mind.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of potential implications here for consciousness. I mean, we can define consciousness in a lot of ways, and that would, of course, would be its whole a whole
Yeah,
separate conversation. But I feel like for a lot of us, we kind of associate consciousness with the imagery or the thoughts that our brain is attending to at that moment, and
yeah,
to have such a prevalent and clear difference in two kind of qualia, two experiences of
yeah,
existence as humans, it's quite profound, really. It feels like.
yeah. It's a good example, isn't it, of a really major invisible difference,
Yeah.
which clearly hasn't received as much attention as it should have done. I mean, one interesting question about aphantasia is whether it's analogous to blind sight, which was
Mm.
actually a possibility that I thought about when studying MX, our original patient. So blind sight is the um, phenomenon by which some people who have lost vision, perhaps in half of their visual field, um, can nevertheless um, guess accurately about what might be happening in the visual field, or direct movement in that visual field. So clearly, some information is coming into the brain. It's allowing accurate guessing,
Mm.
or accurate movement in the absence of consciousness, and it's not as quite as mysterious as it sounds, because we know that information coming into the brain from the eyes travels in on a number of pathways, not just that kind of royal road to the primary visual cortex, and presumably blind sight depends on activity in some of these alternative pathways. So could aphantasia be similar? One reason for thinking it might be similar is the one I kind of mentioned right at the start, that people with aphantasia can often answer questions which, at least superficially, look as if they would require imagery. So could it
Mm.
be that you're able to draw on unconscious imagery to answer those questions, but for some reason the representations that are available to people with aphantasia don't generate a conscious experience. So
Yeah.
if that's the case, then defining the differences in brain activity between people with imagery and people with aphantasia could could be one source of insight into the workings of consciousness.
Yeah, I didn't even think about it until just this very moment, but I recently interviewed Michael Graziano from
Right.
Princeton, and
Yeah.
he is known for the attention schema theory of consciousness.
Yeah.
And in it, he posits that the waking awareness of something is comes along the ride as an informational descriptor, right? It's a piece of information of that experience, and I'm sure part of that could also be the imagery of it, but it need not be, right?
Mm.
And so I wonder if, in some regards, you can just say that the person with aphantasia might have the descriptor, they have the information, they have the associations. Like if I see something, I have the index to search all of the associated stimuli, and I have the descriptor. I just don't get access to the field that has the image in it, right?
Mm.
But I have everything else.
Yeah. And
So
then that
it's
raises
interesting.
the very interesting question of what does the conscious experience of the image give you beyond the other
Yeah.
the
And
other
that's like the scientist
images? Yeah.
who studied red, right?
Yeah.
Mary's.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Is there?
I suspect it does give you something, but it's clearly relatively subtle. It's not as pervasive an effect as you might have thought it
Yeah,
would be.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Is there an aspect of this that you yourself are particularly keen on these days? Is there something like a burning question for you that you feel like is maybe like either a linchpin in making a breakthrough here, or just something that you're truly just curious about for yourself?
Well, I mean, I feel all the kind of avenues that we've discussed are they're all rather dear to me because
Mm.
um, um, I've been thinking about this fairly intensively over the last 10 years. So, I'm very keen to answer all these questions. Are there subtypes? Is there a genetic basis? What's the difference in brain activity? Can we be said to have unconscious imagery? I'm also very keen to get a bit closer to the experience itself. I mean, I guess I've spent my life as a clinician, and I think clinicians actually respect first person reports, possibly more than psychologists do, because of course in medicine you absolutely rely on what people are telling you about their experience, and it's usually a very good guide to what's happening in them. Um, but you also keep your distance
Mm-hmm.
as a clinician, and something I'm looking forward to over the next few years is getting to know some people with aphantasia and aphantasia better, and trying to get close to their lives in a way, to get a feel for how these differences in experience um, interact with all the other things that are going on
Yeah.
with and in them.
I saw, or I heard, I should say, there was a Radio Lab episode, I believe it was last year on Aphantasia, and they
Mhm.
mentioned something to the effect of there might be some ways to cure, maybe isn't the right word, but to reawaken visual imagery for people with aphantasia. They think maybe through some kind of stimulation, maybe neurofeedback, some
Mhm.
kind of practice, they might be able to not turn the lights all the way on per se, but might be able to amplify something and give somebody at least an increase in imagery. Is that something you've seen, and do you think that
Um,
has
so,
power?
so some people have described imagery coming and going with particular drug treatments, for example. People with aphantasia, of course, often dream visually, not always. You don't, but many do. People with aphantasia quite often experience hypnagogic imagery, so imagery
Mm,
just as they're drifting off to sleep. And that's a very fertile time for imagery and visualizers. And it's really interesting that it should give rise to imagery in people with aphantasia. It just raises the question of whether um, there's something that's inhibiting
mm,
imagery in aphantasia. Maybe it's not so much a lack as a kind of as some kind of active inhibition. That's an intriguing possibility. Um, I guess I haven't thought of aphantasia as a deficit or a condition that needs to be cured. I genuinely do think of it
yeah.
as more of a variation in experience that's intriguing and probably has both advantages and disadvantages. We actually had an opportunity to kind of put this to the test in 2019 when we organised a conference for people with aphantasia and hyperphantasia. And I'd been a bit worried that this might be an encounter between one group of people who were feeling very hard done by because they didn't have something, and another group of people who were feeling rather pleased with themselves because they had it in spades. But in fact, it wasn't like that at all. The participants from both sides clearly appreciated that there were pros and cons in both directions. And when we asked the people in the audience with aphantasia whether they would like to be given imagery if a treatment were available, there was quite a clear consensus that they would like it, but just for a day. So they were curious what this experience was like, but they didn't
Yeah.
really feel that they were missing anything that needed to be replaced. They were getting along okay.
I think I'd like to say blissfully ignorant. It
Yeah,
sounds overwhelming,
yeah, yeah,
honestly. When I
yeah,
think about what other people experience,
yeah.
it sounds like a lot to take in at any given moment. I
Mm-hmm.
like the silence, nothingness that happens up
Yeah,
here, I think.
yeah, yeah. You
Well,
like
with that, Adam,
a quiet mind.
yes,
Yeah,
it feels that way for me
yeah,
at least.
yeah.
We are coming up on time. I want to respect yours. And with that, I want to just give you a chance to maybe leave us with any final thoughts here. I know that you recently had a publication that came out, and it sounds like you're actively still working on this, all of this work quite actively. So, is there anything you'd like to just leave the listeners with?
Yeah, so if I can self promote for a moment, the
Please?
book I've recently published is called The Shape of Things Unseen: A New Science of Imagination. It's due to be published in the States, I think, towards the end of March. It was published here a couple of weeks ago, and it touches on the topics of aphantasia and hyperphantasia and treats them in some detail in a final chapter, which is called Extreme Imagination. But it's really a tour of imagination more generally, and it explores four key ideas. The first is simply the observation that we all live a lot of our lives in our heads. Um, it turns out that people daydream for between 25% and 50% of the time. It's a very common pursuit, and when we're not daydreaming, we're very often thinking about the past, the future, you know, entering virtual worlds of one kind or another. So we live a lot of our lives in our heads. That becomes slightly less surprising, and this is the second key idea in the book, when we appreciate that our moment to moment experience is, of course, generated inside our heads. Even your perceptual experience of the room in front of you depends on ceaseless um, energy requiring activity in your brain and a very long training in how to see. So you're using hard-won knowledge of the visual world to predict the world into being, so to speak. And then the third idea is that what happens for those of us with sensory imagery when we imagine in sensory ways is that um, we run the perceptual system offline, if you like. So
Mm,
people who can visualize run their visual system offline when they are visualizing. Um, it may well be that many animals can do that. So quite likely our cats and dogs do dream. What seems to be distinctive about us, and this is the fourth key idea, is that we have evolved to share what we imagine.
Mm.
Through our symbolic capacity, through our capacity to mind share, which I think has a fascinating evolutionary and developmental history. We've become able to share the contents of our minds. So those are the key ideas in the background of this book. I'm hoping that the next book will focus more specifically on aphantasia and hyperphantasia, because I think there's still masses to learn and say about them.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating topic, Adam, and like I said, one that I hold dear to
Yeah.
my heart. Something that's been really interesting for me. So I really appreciate you taking the time and talking with
Okay.
me about it.
Thanks very much. I've enjoyed the conversation.